So, how we doing, guys? I'm Lawrence Rosenberg, host of the Alpha Human podcast, and our guest today is Geoff Woo. Geoff is the CEO and co-founder of HVMN, a Silicon Valley-based cutting-edge nutrition company that is absolutely obsessed with helping people get to the top of their field, set a new world record, and cultivate a long, healthy life. Geoff is also a Stanford-trained computer scientist and self-proclaimed biohacker. He's an expert in nootropics, smart drugs, and smart supplements. He's also an expert in the field of fasting, ketosis, the ketogenic diet. He's the creator of the world's first drinkable ketone ester, and he's the host of the Health via Modern Nutrition podcast. Geoff, welcome to the show.
Lawrence, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. Glad to be on the program.
My pleasure. My pleasure. By the way, the Health via Nutrition, is that the way that you describe the company? And then the acronym is HVMN, HVMN, but it's pronounced human?
We pronounce it by the acronym. So we actually pronounce it HVMN. It's a little bit more clear, and it's kind of the cool future way of how people spell in the future. No vowels. Yeah, now that, okay. Very interesting.
So thanks for clearing that up for me. So I got to say, it's an interesting dichotomy being the founder of a nutrition business and being also a huge believer in feeding the body and the mind with the right types of foods and supplements, whilst also being a believer in the enormous benefit of taking in no food and no nutrition or supplements for extended periods of time if we're talking about fasting.
Well, yeah, 100%. I think that it might be Zen or philosophical, but the things you do and the things you don't do are really two sides of the same coin. If you are sitting, that is essentially a form of physical practice. It's if you sit on your butt for 12 hours a day, that's essentially what you're exercising your muscles to get attuned to and accustomed to. So that's obviously what we don't really think about as exercising, but by the fact of not exercising, you are forcing us action. And I think the same thing applies to nutrition. The fact that you can consume things is just as interesting and as important as the pause, the non-consumption of things. So to me, it's just two ways of attacking the same problem.
Absolutely. Very, very interesting. So I have to ask, because a lot of what your company is about when it comes to the type of nutrition or the type of foods we should be feeding ourselves, as well as a lot of your own personal experiences, really kind of centers potentially, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, around ketosis, and it's certainly a major component of what you do personally in your personal health practice for yourself, as well as what you preach and where your company kind of steps into the game with some really unique supplements. But can you explain your fascination with ketosis and also ketogenic nutrition, and I mean, what it does and why it works?
Sure. So it might be helpful just to define ketosis for folks who might just be being introduced to the topic. So ketosis is a state of metabolism where your body is burning its own fat stores and converting that fat into a form of energy called ketones. And that ketones is produced by your liver. And this usually happens when your body is restricting carbohydrates. So you cut out sugar, carbs, your body's essentially forced to be in this fat burning mode. And this fat burning mode is essentially your body using fat and ketones as energy. And I think the genesis, for me at least, was, I would say, very different from how most people enter into ketosis or get interested in the topic. So 4 or 5 years ago, I was interested in cognitive performance. And one of the interesting pieces of literature was showing that fasting or non-eating was one of the most reliable ways to generate new neurons, neurogenesis. And that's kind of counterintuitive, and it was in the sense that if you don't eat, you can actually somehow boost performance. But as I dug into the literature, there's such a wealth of new research and data around how these thoughtful pauses of consumption is not even really a positive consumption fasting. It's really just what normal state should be. If you think about what's the standard Western or standard American diet is, it's essentially overconsumption. So to me, again, it's what is your perspective? And to me, ketosis should be a natural state of metabolism that our bodies enter on a somewhat regular basis. Whereas in the standard Western diet, especially in the diet over the last 50, 100 years with processed industrialized foods, we never are in a state of ketosis because we're always, one, over-consuming, and two, eating very heavily processed carbohydrates. So to me, I think the 1-2 punch of why ketosis was an interesting metabolic state was, one, just that initial inkling of it being interested in cognitive performance. Mm-hmm. And that's in reference to perhaps a lot of people getting interested in ketosis for weight management or weight loss. My goals were very much on the enhancement side of things, but I think, again, as you dive more into the literature, all these things kind of come full circle, where enhancement is bring a state from perhaps normal states to enhanced states, and medicine or therapeutics is bringing someone from a deficient state to a normal state. But it's the same vector, right? You just bring someone from one end of the spectrum to the other side of the spectrum. So I see it as the same thing. So for me, ketosis is interesting from a performance perspective, especially in cognition. And as you dive deeper and deeper into the literature, there was interesting performance benefits for athletic use cases, for endurance use cases, especially with exogenous ketones like the ketone ester that I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit, mm-hmm. as well as ketosis being very interesting and implicated in some of the chronic diseases that are really pernicious to our society. And it's, I think, especially within the context of COVID-19, one of the biggest comorbidities with COVID-19 and death is insulin resistance, diabetes, poor metabolic health. And ketosis is kind of like the flip side of that. Being able to go into a state of ketosis is a sign of metabolic flexibility. So to me, again, just wrapping my thoughts here, ketosis was very central in what I saw in amongst a number of fields, from sports performance on the enhancement or biohacking side, as well as therapeutic research around diseases like chronic diseases, as well as the burgeoning new field around longevity, anti-aging research. And ketosis and its pathways was central to all of these different fields of discipline. So to me, I don't think of ketogenic diet, ketosis, as some magical thing. To me, it's just a very interesting scientific phenomenon in our physiology. And we need to understand how to best manipulate and exploit that metabolic state for our individual use cases. So there's pros and cons for it, and we can talk about the nuances. Mm-hmm. But the fact that it's so central to so many interesting parts of human performance and human longevity and human health, it's a very interesting place to start building knowledge and building products and building services around it.
Yeah, you mentioned when you remove carbs, you remove sugar. Processed foods are, full of the products of industrialized agriculture and food manufacturing. But when you remove all of that, you're left, if we're talking macronutrients, you're left with two other macronutrients, right? You're left with protein, you're left with fats. Yep. And you start to get back to where we were historically as a species. Obviously, you couldn't go and buy a loaf of bread 12,000 years ago prior to the advent of agriculture. So we were, as you mentioned, in the natural state of ketosis. And although it's not magic, it's very scientific. The body adopted to be able to use that, that substrate and use it because we would probably go days without food, which probably gets us to the point where you being a big proponent of fasting and how you came upon ketosis and you can generate these neurons. The key is that if you're going to remove what was not in our diet 12,000 years ago and what's left, is fat and protein, but there's a different camps over there about how much protein you should have in your diet, how much fat should you have in your diet. And I think I want to get into that with you in a bit. But if we're talking about fasting, what I've been curious about for quite some time is whether the magic of fasting is that we're producing ketones, or are there other things at play as well that give the body enormous power to heal itself, like maybe the ejecting of dead or zombie cells through autophagy, and maybe other processes that the body undergoes when we are not consuming calories?
Yeah, that's actually just an open field of inquiry. So that's an open field of science that is being determined now. So here's my thoughts about fasting and potentially the differences or overlaps with the presence of ketogenic diet ketosis. Okay. So my thinking here is that I think fasting works and it's primarily mediated through ketosis. So I think there's a massive overlap of being in a ketogenic state and with the benefit of fasting. However, do I think that there is benefit for calorie restriction, and which is basically 100% calorie restriction, which is basically fasting? There is probably something there that is beneficial for acute bouts of 0 calorie consumption. But I think the thing with autophagy is that there's no magic threshold that we've been able to identify, or a magic biomarker that shows when something is in autophagy, right? If you actually look at the system, like I think that the autophagy is sort of a magic umbrella term. But if you look at, but all of our cells, we have trillions of cells, and some cells are in a catabolic state, and some cells are in an anabolic state. Some are building up, and some are being torn down. Right. So autophagy describes perhaps a broad pattern of what our bodies are going through. Clearly, there is breakdown of this, damaged organelles, but it's not very precise. So there's an open inquiry exactly what kind of threshold of calorie restriction induces the level of autophagy you want. I think there's a sub question around, is there tissue specificity for autophagy? Meaning that, for example, your lean muscle tissue is going to break down or go into autophagy at a different rate than, for example, your neurons or your liver or your kidney, right? Like all these different cells have different metabolisms in of itself. So I think when people have that broad stroke, is autophagy on or off when you're fasting? It's, I would say, directionally correct that if you are in a calorie restricted state or a ketogenic state, you're likely to trigger metabolic pathways that drive autophagy or signal autophagy. So I think that's just a little bit more precise way to talk about it. So to me, it's like a ketogenic diet versus fasting. What you're really playing around with is sort of deletion of a macronutrient. You're leaving out carbohydrate, and potentially there's a deletion of, and you're reducing the carbohydrates. And I think the only other dimension that you can manipulate your diet is time, right? So fasting is essentially a time manipulation. Ketogenic diet is a macro manipulation, which is a second dimension of how you can manipulate a diet. And then the third dimension you can manipulate a diet is the amount of something you can consume, right? Can you be restricting calories? I think when you have exogenous ketones or ketone esters, that adds like an interesting research tool at the very least of how you can manipulate and study this fact. I think that's where we're working with a lot of researchers and scientists actually, because to study ketones, you would have to put people through a ketogenic diet. Right. But what if you could have people on a normal diet and then you add ketones exogenously? Could you replicate the benefit of a ketogenic diet or of fasting? And that research is being unpacked now. And I think what the literature seems to say is that ketones definitely are a powerful metabolic signal. They're not just like a fuel for the cells. They actually signal how the DNA unfolds. They signal longevity pathways. They signal things like FOXO3, which are longevity genes. Mm-hmm. So that is a good signal or a good piece of evidence where the ketones themselves are definitely something interesting and special in of themselves.
So, that's interesting. I want to talk a bit more about exogenous ketones in a moment, because that brings up a whole another level of very interesting possibilities.
Yeah.
I guess one of the things I would, I'd like to delve into is the whole concept of biohacking, because that's where ketone esters play a role, as well as some of the other things you've done in your history. Again, you're a self-proclaimed biohacker, right? And, fasting and ketosis is a big part of today's biohacking movement, I think. And the first time I ever even heard of the term biohacking was in stumbling upon Dave Asprey's blog, Bulletproof Executive, right? In like 2014 or 2015. But as I really delved deeper into that concept, it turns out biohacking's been around, as an idea at least since 1988, perhaps, where it was discussed in an article in the Washington Post called "Playing God in Your Basement," where they talked about the rise of the biohacker and bathtub biology, and predicted that computer hackers would fuse software with biotech to craft new models of proteins and enzymes and organic chemicals. So, it's interesting that you're trained as a computer scientist. And, also something that, interesting. I mean, your company is based in Silicon Valley. That's not on the surface, it's not the likely candidate city for a nutrition company. But then when you start to think about Silicon Valley, when you start to think about those who are being very productive in the tech world and kind of leaning towards, the concept of biohacking and how it is very relatable to systems and software, then it starts to make sense. But I guess I'd like to hear it from you. What inspired you to get into first of all, what is biohacking, and then what inspired you to get involved in it?
Sure. So maybe I want to unpack the biohacking term first. I think there's just a number of different interesting subgroups of that share the term biohacker, right? So I would say that there are, I have good friends who are genetically engineering, using CRISPR or whatnot to make glowing yeast for beer production, right? Or they're injecting myosin altered genes into their arm to see if they can grow their muscle through gene editing, right? And I think that's definitely a sphere of biohacking. I would say that there's also biohackers that are more of like the grinder type, which install, on the basic side, like magnets into their fingertips to sort of induce like a sixth sense of detecting magnetism. Or they're installing, I had, this guy who's kind of like a biohacker artist who installed antenna that he kind of surgically into his skull, and that would detect the wavelength of light that his antenna was focusing on, and would vibrate at different intensities so you could feel colors. So that's like a grinder kind of mechanical fusion of biology and machine. And then I would say that my ilk of biohacker, if that's the way to talk about it, is the way I think about it is primarily from the definition I like to use is that I'm just simply taking a systems engineering approach to human performance. And what I mean by that is I just take quantitative, measurable inputs and outputs of my body, my system, and and these quantitative measures can be optimized and engineered and pushed in certain directions. So for example, I like defining a car, right? There's attributes of a car that we all know. How fast does it go? The mileage per gallon? Is it safe? But cars can perform very, very differently. Like a Model T the initial Ford car is a car, the latest Tesla is a car, but the attributes are very, very different. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's car engineering was evolved to produce a better version of a car. And I think we're at the cusp here with my style or approach towards biohacking, which is like, can we finally apply formal engineering techniques towards driving human performance in a way that we want? So I think nutrition is one of the most common inputs into the human system that can drive particular outputs. So I think that's like a very attractive, or maybe not the word attractive, but a very tractable first place to start in terms of engineering a better performance. So to me, biohacking is kind of like a very nascent community or level of rigor of what I think the space will evolve to. Just like in the 70s and 80s, there was a homebrew computing club, and those kids basically, like kids like Steve Jobs, are tinkering with silicon parts and then building computers and seeing what they could do. They spawned an entire new industry and a new field of inquiry around computer engineering. And you have subdomains of machine learning experts, data scientists, software engineers. I think you'll see the same thing with biohackers, just really spawning human performance engineers, right? And I think there's aspects of that with like personal trainers, dietitians, all of that, I think are kind of in the same sphere. But can we kind of unify this holistically with a more of a engineering mindset, a more of a quantitative, numeric mindset? That's a kind of the approach that I'm advocating for and thinking about.
Right. So, I mean, that's powerful because, I mean, you start to, I mean, for the average person, to think about the fusion of man and machine, it's science fiction.
Yep.
In Silicon Valley, you might have friends or acquaintances that are doing some really wild things, like putting the antenna right in or maybe something more mundane like putting chips in order to open doors, right? And doing that kind of thing. But that element for most people is just not something they would, number one, consider doing or even realize is feasible. Then you have the merging of genetics, right? The creation of synthetic biology and how that synthetic biology can be fused with our own to maybe one day be able to withstand living on another planet. Again, science fiction, but actually taking place. It's just that most people don't realize that.
Yeah.
And then, you have something that is far more relatable to, most people, which is I can be a biohacker by simply changing my diet, using different supplements, and having an incredible increase in quality of life performance because, I'm taking a hack, right? I'm finding a shortcut or a new route to feeling great. So it's powerful stuff, but how would you say that today's biohacking is different from what it was or what was going on maybe a decade or two ago? Like, I'd love to hear your perspective on how's today's biohacker different?
The technology has evolved. The fact that we have medical grade devices that can be tracking our glucose continuously. For example, you can have a consumer grade continuous glucose monitor that tracks your blood sugar. You can have wearables, rings, like, there's a number of these vendors mm-hmm. that let you track your heart rate variability, that tracks your sleep. And there's different groups working on more and more of these devices that track these blood markers and these performance markers that are going to be ubiquitous in the coming years. that is the big difference. Where, again, for me, it's about engineering. And what engineers say is that if you can't measure something, how can you optimize it? Well, now you can measure a lot more dang things as opposed to 10 years ago. So that's the biggest difference. For example, I can show you with my finger stick where my blood sugar is or where my blood ketones are after a ketogenic diet or after fasting or after a ketone ester drink. And that kind of technology, that kind of tools just wasn't widely available 10, 20 years ago.
So, okay, absolutely. And I guess, because you mentioned something that I've been thinking about for a while, but it's like, with a hack that allows you to manipulate the myostatin gene, you're starting to get into territory where, currently, that changes the game for sports alone. If people can start manipulating the density of their muscle tissue, and it's undetectable for now anyway. What is that going to mean for sports? But also, and then it's the cosmetic. We've all seen those genetically altered cows, those big bluebell cows. They look like Mr. Olympia, right? They're bigger than Mr. Olympia. It's absolutely unbelievable. But we don't have to go that far to experience, at least, from my, from my own playing around with ketones over the past 4 years. I had gotten into a state where I almost felt superhuman. My mind felt superhuman. My ability to do incredible things on only 4 hours sleep, the ability to recall words and ideas and concepts, and the ability to speak just at a very high level without even having to think about my next word, was absolutely incredible when I had discovered that. So that's a hack that it's not expensive, it's not undoable, it's open to everybody. And your company actually is helping people achieve this kind of thing. So that leads me into wanting to know a bit more about because part of this show is about, I want to inspire others. I want to bring on those who can bring new knowledge, new ideas, mavericks, innovators that can optimize people's lives and health and mindset. And a lot of that inspiration I look to for myself and also to share with other people comes from individuals like yourself that start a company like the one you've started. So I'd love to hear about your entrepreneurial journey. I understand that you sold your first company, Glass Map, I believe, to Groupon. Then you started a nootropics company, which again are, for the uninitiated, are smart drugs or smart supplements. That was called Nutrabox, I believe. And then over the past few years, you've built Human. So please tell us.
So Nutrabox evolved into HVMN. Yeah. So where to begin? I think, I think just in this day and age, I think we're all creatives at some level, right? Like, you're creating a podcast and creating a community. And I think one of the best vehicles to create the change you want to see in the world is through a community or through a startup or a new business. Those are just, I think that's just kind of how the game works in this capitalistic society now. Mm-hmm. So my first entrepreneurial venture was building an iPhone app to let you track your friends on a map. And this was back circa 2011, right? So very, very early iPhone days. Wow. And like the location kit was very, very raw for the APIs for all the iPhones. And then if you remember back in those days, this is like really battery intensive to like have your map on all the time. Like, you would just kill your battery in like 2 hours. So that was a problem we were trying to solve. Okay, can we basically have a really battery efficient location tracking app? And me and a couple buddies from the Stanford EE and CS programs, we decided to just go and build an app. It seemed like it was just like a magical time, I would say, at Stanford in Silicon Valley, where the Instagram founders are a couple years older than us. The Snapchat founders were like a year under us. Just like a lot of people were just like making apps. And I think we were so arrogant at the time because we were building like operating systems and networking routers for our classes. And it's like, oh, we could definitely build a freaking app. And then you just realize that building software for real people is actually much, much harder than doing a program for a problem set. But that was an early taste. Was building this little company while we're seniors in the computer science program. And then we got funded by this startup investor group called Y Combinator before we graduated. And it was like, they gave us $170,000 for the three of us to start this company. And at the time when we were like 21 and 22, it seemed like a ridiculous infinite amount of money at the time. And it's like, okay, I guess we're doing this. And it was kind of a haphazard choice because I had a choice to either go work at Facebook, finish my master's degree at Stanford, or do a PhD in computer science at Princeton, or do this random app startup. And it just seemed like, oh, we got $170,000. You might as well give it a swing.
Okay.
We end up doing that, and you just learn a lot by just like being out in the real world, just like no one really giving a crap about what you're doing until you actually solve problems for people. And I think you just learn some of these like reality checks going from the ivory tower of academia and Stanford to like, okay, in the real world, no one cares unless you actually do something valuable for others. And I think that was just a good little mini MBA, if you will, around making sure you just actually listen to your users, your customers, actually solve people's problems and not just solve problems for your own ego, right? And long story short, sold that company to Groupon in 2013. And that gave me a little bit of time to think about what problems I wanted to work on next. And at the time, I remember all my friends at the CS programs were making robots better, making machine learning algorithms better, making robots better, all the stuff. And but it was also like kind of like, that's a fancy way of saying they're also helping big companies like help you click more ads, right? Like that was kind of the business model at the time. It just didn't seem that interesting to me.
Okay.
And I wanted to work on something more personal, right? Like we're all humans. Why can't we be better? Why can't I work on making humans better? And it was just very kind of selfish at the time. Just like, hey, I want to just be more productive and like just be even more type A. How to, get more done. And it was just like this interesting journey through the biohacking community, all the random subreddits where people are just trading weird research chemical tips and doing all these self-experimentations. And, that was just an interesting opportunity there where I just realized that more people were experimenting with this stuff circa 2014.
Right.
And I was trying to like source some of this stuff myself, but it's really hard to get really high grade pure ingredients that are lab tested. I was just ordering bags of white powder from Alibaba. There are research chemicals for some of the stuff, just making my own. And it's like, hey, there's got to be just a more clean way to do it. So we just made our own in a validated third party, certified GMP lab, all of that good stuff. And just like learn how to manufacture stuff. And then going from there, slowly building up a community and audience. I remember, maybe 6-7 months in, me and my partner, Michael, we were doing $80,000 a month in sales. And we're like, whoa, this is like a real business now. Like we were just like kind of running this as like a hobby, if you will. Just like, hey, we want these nootropics for ourselves. Now, like if we do 80 times 12, that's like almost $1 million a year revenue. It's like, whoa, like this could be a real thing. And that's when we really started scaling up. And along the whole time, I was just getting more and more interested in the science side. Because I think I'm naturally skeptical. And I remember, like, I think the first time just getting the space, it just like didn't make sense that there to be like obvious free lunches, right? There's always this sense of what's the catch? And is just BS? Is there good data behind this? And a lot of things don't have good data behind it. And I think that's what made some of the things that do have good, robust data really, really exciting. So that's kind of the full journey there. And then I think you fast forward, we partnered with Oxford researchers who had developed a ketone ester as part of a DARPA program in the early 2000s. And we just got really, really sophisticated and deep from kind of a biohacking kind of hobbyist amateur perspective into really partnering, working with legitimate world authorities in biotechnology and human physiology to produce some really outstanding products.
So, okay. So you mentioned, so there's something I want to touch on there. So first of all, you were, ordering like, random powders, well, not random powders, but you were ordering powders.
Yeah, not quite random, but just like powders.
From Alibaba, and you're getting these powders, you're making pills.
Yeah.
You're making your own supplements.
Yeah.
And these supplements would be to help with cognition, I'm assuming, right? So, so these would be the types of supplements that would optimize, and it's a gray area. Do some have drug-like reactions? Do some not? What are the active ingredients? But they're, you're hoping that in high enough dosages, they're going to sharpen your mind and give you, powerful mental effects of acuity and cognition and recall and this kind of thing, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you move from that into partnering with some Oxford researchers who were doing some interesting things with ketone esters on a project or projects with DARPA. Now, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. That's the agency within the U.S. government or within the U.S. military that makes all of the futuristic, wild stuff, from brain links to a computer through to, I think they were the ones experimenting with the first driverless cars. I mean, they're the cutting edge of the cutting edge, and they partner with private industry, right? But what is DARPA doing? What is that very advanced military agency doing looking into ketone esters?
Yeah, great question. Well, part of the mandate, I think, is kind of moonshot technologies. And obviously the warfighter, him or herself, is an important asset. If you call a soldier or a sailor or a Marine an asset, but they're a part of that defense capability. So anything that can enhance metabolism and performance of that service member is of interest to, potentially towards the US DoD. So there was a program called Metabolic Dominance that actually is looking at different technologies to enhance metabolism. And the ketone ester was one of the main projects funded out of that umbrella, that Metabolic Dominance Program that was kicked off by DARPA.
That's amazing because, I mean, if you just think about that, if you know that the military has a super soldier program, you know that, you look into the research, you see that there's a substrate that the human body uses that if you were somehow able to manufacture it and the body could use it exogenously, and that it would give you the level of optimization that would interest DARPA, then, hey, guys and gals out there, I mean, that's a signal. You need to take this ketosis and ketogenic approach to your nutrition extremely seriously, because if the military is looking into what it can do for their soldiers, imagine for a very low cost, what you could do for your own health, your own optimization, your own metabolism. And, I guess, there's been a ton of research into developing exogenous ketones for, everything from what we just discussed and, optimize your metabolism for a soldier to potentially solving neurologic disorders, through to being, a performance enhancing superfuel for athletes. However, making one that the body can use and that actually works I know because I've been tracking this for years now, trying, looking into, does this actually work? I remember Peter Attia, kind of getting his hands on something that was early days experimental. You know this, right? Drinking it, and it tasted, he kind of called it rocket fuel. It tasted like literal, not good rocket fuel, right? Like what rocket fuel would taste like. So actually producing something that would work, that doesn't taste like gasoline, or is even close to affordable, by the way, enough to manufacture for mass consumption, has been an incredible struggle, but you have done it. And, so tell me about that, because, I see on, in your business that I could buy a ketone ester drink. It's still, expensive is relative, but compared to what it could have cost 3 years ago, the scale at which you're producing it, $89, I think, for like 3 servings of, which would be 25 grams of ketone ester per serving, is still, for the average person, expensive. But it apparently, this would put you into a deep, rapid state of ketosis. Now, I would assume that the reason you'd want to do that is if you're a high performance athlete, if you're going to if you're going to run a marathon tomorrow, or if you want to train for a triathlon. I would personally be doing one of these before every training session. But is that what that ketone ester that you make is for? Who's it for? What's it for? And what does it really do?
Yeah, that's a number of questions to unpack here. And I really need to give credit to, bringing this down to a scale that is possible to be marketed. It's still expensive. It's still super expensive, right? I mean, even at, $30 a pop, that's, I wish I could be drinking them every single day.
Right.
I don't drink my own supply, like it's too expensive for me. But it was really been a massive team effort, a number of researchers, really kicked off by Professor Karen Clark, who runs a large lab at Oxford, and Dr. Richard Veach, who recently actually passed. He was a lab chief at the NIH. They had co-invented the ketone ester back in the early 2000s. And there's been so many researchers and co-authors that have shepherded all the clinical research to show safety, first of all, and then show efficacy in some of these indications. And then on the manufacturing side, I still work very closely with Professor Clark to scale this up and get the volumes and get the chemical engineering to a place where we can start manufacturing metric tons of the stuff. And to give you a sense of where this all initially started, it would have cost $1,000 per gram of ketone ester.
Wow.
And some of the developments with synthetic biology, so you can use genetically engineered E. coli to ferment sugar into some of the precursors, as one of the recent technological engineering feats that unlocked some of the supply chain cost savings of how you can manufacture this at scale. And maybe to tease into why it was so expensive is that in traditional, if you look at organic molecules, many organic molecules have chirality. They have different forms that have the same chemical formula, but they're mirror images of each other. So if you look at your hands, right, each your left and your right hand have 4 fingers, 1 thumb, right? The same chemical formula, but they do not overlay. Wow. That same chirality property exists for a number of organic molecules. And one of the organic molecules that has chirality is beta-hydroxybutyrate, BHB, the main ketone body. And interestingly, your body only endogenously produces D-beta-hydroxybutyrate. And there's an L form of L-beta-hydroxybutyrate. When you run a synthetic chemical reaction, like the chemicals don't care. Right. They just turn into what's called a racemic mix, 50-50 D and L. And because they're the same exact atomic weight, it's very, very hard to separate D and L. But we care about D versus L in biology because your body uses D-BHB and L-BHB. It's not really naturally produced at very high levels. Okay. So there's different interpretations of what L-BHB does in the body. Some researchers will claim that it might be toxic. It could be really bad for you. Some researchers say that it is actually not that bad. It hangs around in your system for a little bit, but then you pee it out. Mm-hmm. And some researchers actually think it could be actually useful for maybe longevity signaling because it does last longer in the system. So there's open science on what L exactly does. But I think the most conservative and the most data-driven point of view here is that D-BHB is what is produced by your liver naturally in ketogenesis. Mm-hmm. And that's the form that we care about. And selecting only D is a very expensive process. But if you have a synthetically engineered E. coli that produces only D, well, you save a lot of manufacturing and purification costs along the way. So that's a little bit of the history and story of why it costs so much, what are the subtleties behind the different little forms of beta-hydroxybutyrate and why it matters, and why the ketone ester that we have is pretty interesting because it's D-beta-hydroxybutyrate in an ester form. So what is it useful for? Well, the best clinical data that exists was, and what got me excited about it initially was athletic performance use cases. There was an award-winning paper in Cell Metabolism 2016 showing that it enhanced endurance performance of trained cyclists by 2-3%.
By what percent?
2 to 3%. So this is like 500 meters, 400, 500 meters in a 30-minute time trial.
I mean, people might not understand, but 2 to 3% at an elite level makes a world record.
Yeah, that's big. Yeah, so I think sports performance is like one of those interesting fields where, I think that's exactly right. For the layperson, it's like, I don't know, like I have a bad day, like my performance drops 50%, right? It's just like, but if you talk to Olympic caliber athletes, world-class athletes, they're very, very consistent. And it's very hard to enhance and to increase by that kind of range. So, I mean, that's like the top line head result, but I think some of the interesting parts around it is that there was a reduction in lactate production. So you produce less lactic acid. There's interesting subsequent research showing that it improves inflammation and recovery after intense bouts of exercise. And we've been working with a number of Tour de France teams over the last couple of years. It's kind of unfortunate the Tour is canceled this year. Yep. But that's been very cool to support some of the top teams and see the riders do really well because the initial studies essentially were almost optimized for a Tour de France-like scenario where it's a quite specific event where it's not really normal to bike 60 to 120 miles a day, for like 30 days straight. Right. So it was interesting initially from an endurance perspective, but as people had more opportunity to use ketone ester as a research tool, I think there's a lot of exciting research being done currently, and well, not currently because all the clinical human trials are stopped, but hopefully that we're kind of in progress and people are contemplating. And it reflects on some of the earlier topics. There's a lot of excitement around neurological conditions. Yep. Again, too early and way too speculative to make any sort of claims here. And I'm not going to be talking about the product itself, but talk about the science and what the data exists. There's a great published case study from Dr. Mary Newport using ketone ester drinks that showed essentially reversal of Alzheimer's symptoms. And the main mechanism of action suggested there is that for types of Alzheimer's, and some people nickname forms of Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes, that is there a glucose uptake dysfunction in neurons? Is there sort of like an insulin resistance in the brain? Well, the cool thing with ketones is that it does not require insulin. It's a completely separate metabolic pathway than glucose. So maybe what's happening with an Alzheimer's patient is that the brain is just being starved of energy. It just can't get glucose in. And you keep eating food, you do IV drips of more glucose. There's something wrong with the uptake function in terms of glucose can't get in the cell. You might have glucose floating around, but whether insulin or PDH, pyruvate, dehydrogenase, there's something wrong with getting it in. What if you can get it in with another route? And ketones is that other route. So that would be the mechanism that's there. There's been some early look investigating Parkinson's, and that has to do with the redox pairs in the Krebs cycle. There's different ratios of NADH, NAD+, NADPH, NADPH plus that I think is getting more awareness. People have probably heard of NAD boosters, right? Nicotinamide riboside, nicotinamide mononucleotide as popular supplements for longevity. And why people think those are interesting is that because they provide the substrate or the redox pairs for the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is what you learn in high school biology, which is the cycle in the mitochondria that produces ATP. So I think what people are realizing now is that you want to make sure you have enough of the NAD pool, like the amount of nicotinamide in there to have enough of these redox pairs. But I think what people are realizing is that the ratio is also very important as well. And ketones manipulate that ratio in a preferable way for some of these conditions, potentially. So that's exciting news on the therapeutic potential. But those are, I would say, just more speculative. I think just getting more back into reality, there's a bunch of good research coming out of Jonathan Little's group at University of British Columbia showing that a ketone ester drink just acutely drops blood sugar. It increases insulin sensitivity. So if you do an oral glucose tolerance test, which is a 75-gram sugar bomb,
right,
and you see your sugar and insulin curves, if you have a ketone ester drink before one compared to a placebo, your glycemic response is much more reduced.
That's incredible.
So I think there's like interesting applications for glycemic response and potentially appetite control. One of my good friends, Brianna Stubbs, she published a paper on a ketone ester drink suppressing ghrelin, which is the appetite hormone. So there's all these interesting observations, data points that show benefit of ketones that kind of mimics and replicates what you might surmise to a ketogenic diet, right? Because I think when you look at a ketogenic diet, there is like these kind of observations or claims that, yeah, like I'm just more satiated. I'm not as hungry when I'm eating a ketogenic diet versus a standard Western diet, even though that, like, the calories are the same. So I think some of these things that you're seeing with the ketone ester experiment seems to match up really well with the N equals 10,000 anecdotes that all these folks are kind of reporting with the ketogenic diet. So it's really cool to see the grassroots observations of individuals just reporting in, being thoughtful, being citizen scientists, marry up with what's being published in formal literature. So those are just a little bit of a snapshots of what I think ketone esters could be exciting about. And then that's like not to say there's a lot of research looking at longevity, cognitive performance. You know, we still work with the Department of Defense on research as well. So just assessing, you know, different applications for a number of applications. So it's just it's a fun project to be a part of.
Well, that's amazing. And I know also they've been using it. I think Dom D'Agostino has been working with the Defense Department as well. I think with the SEALs, in order to be able to how far, I mean, you can dive a lot deeper and not have the issue. I forgot what the issue is when you go too deep, the human body can only go so far down without causing potential neurological issues.
Yeah,
right.
The issue is oxygen toxicity. So as you go deeper and deeper, you have to be breathing oxygen, and at a certain pressure and certain depth and certain amount of high oxygen, you just get seizures. So it looks like if you have acetoacetate diester, so a different form of a ketone ester, it
Right.
seems to suppress that. So yeah, so I think there's just a lot of exciting research to be done here. I think one of his students and a friend, Andrew Kutnick, I think also did a great. This is a very recent paper showing that the acetoacetate diester was able to reduce cancer cachexia or muscle wasting in
Right.
animal model. So and I think that kind of replicates kind of our observations with the beta hydroxybutyrate monoester, where there seems to be an anti-catabolic effect with ketones.
And that's powerful. And on top of that, and massive anti-inflammatory effects. I can tell you, I mean, I had surgery a bunch of years ago. I was in deep ketosis. And when I was recovering, I didn't break. The diet still was, I wouldn't even let them put an IV bag with dextrose in it. I wouldn't allow them to do that. So they did that for me. And my CRP numbers, which they were measuring because after surgery, that's how they see, how you're doing with inflammation. My CRP number was, they couldn't believe how low it was.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you think about all of the scientific literature and the studies being done and on top of that, the anecdotal evidence, I mean, it's almost like, wake up, people. You've got to jump on this, on the ketosis bandwagon. You got to get into, you got to get into a ketogenic state. You got to have a ketogenic diet because the optimization for human performance is outlandish. And, you're certainly on the cutting edge of a lot of that. I know your company does a lot of other supplements as well to help with the ketogenic diet, but also nootropics, brain boosting supplements as well. You got a lot of interesting things going on there. And I guess I'm really curious because, again, back to being inspired, because I want to be in ketosis. If it's doing all those other things, imagine what it would do for you simply at work, in your career, and, in your attempt to be a successful entrepreneur or even a successful sales professional, what it could do for you. But back to this inspiration piece, like, you're doing like super cool stuff. You're an entrepreneur. You're running an incredibly interesting nutrition company. What drives you?
I think curiosity drives me. I think it's one of the. I was thinking about this and when I was just like self-reflecting a few years back, and I think, like, again, maybe this is the engineer nerd in me trying to make it too formal, but there's this notion in engineering that you said an objective function, right? What an objective function is, kind of how do you calculate what your goals are and how do you optimize towards that? So for me, I think what captures that notion the best is, how do I keep and maintain a childlike curiosity for as much of what I do for as long as possible? And I just remember, I think we can maybe hopefully recall when we're children and we're playing with toys, and you would just get engrossed with like playing with your Legos or opening up a watch, or I don't know, playing like, making a story with your dolls or whatnot. But I think there was just so much fun and novelty and creativity and just like freedom that we all had in this childlike state. And I think, for better or for worse, our structure of society kind of jams us into boxes. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just what efficiency of a capital system kind of forces us to do, right? It kind of forces specialization of roles. And to be specialized and competitive, you have to be really good at a few things. And I don't think that's a natural state of where people want to be, right? Like, I'm sure you're a podcast host, but I'm sure you also are a partner, an athlete, a number of things that you've done in your life as well, right? And I think that's everyone, right? Like, no one's just a grocery person, right? Like, in their head, they're an artist, they're a historian, they're a gardener, right? And I think so to me, it's like, okay, how do I set up my life and my goals where I can have that creativity and that freedom to explore like all parts of your natural curiosities. So that's the motivation. It's just, I'm genuinely interested in learning. Like, it's just fun. Like, it's great having this conversation because it's just, you get to think about things that you might have not thinking about, just by day-to-day humdrum. And you get to, especially in my line of work, it's just super awesome to talk to world-class athletes, researchers, folks that have served in the defense of our country. And it's just like cool to learn from them. And it's maybe even cooler to be able to help and give advice and be of help to them, right? Like, that would be even better. So just to, round that thought off, to me, it's just like, I just want to be having fun and just keeping that curiosity alive. I think if there's any message, just like, don't let that fire of curiosity just get snuffed out. I feel like, I'm sure, listeners to the Alpha Human podcast are probably folks more geared towards, like, I want to be learning. I want to be a better version of myself. And that's a fire that I think is hard to maintain. And it's something that we have to practice and keep.
That's the thing. It is a lot of things that people assume, well, he or she is just passionate, but actually you have to feed passion like a fire. And you're saying, look, an incredible thing is to be a curious person, but it's so easy to fall into the lane that we're given, or the trap, the box that we fall into, and we lose that childlike sense of curiosity. It's something you have to work at, is what you're saying. And I think that's super powerful. So Geoff, what do you see coming down the road, right? You're a curious person. You're on the cutting edge. Like, if we were to shoot out a decade, what do you see coming down the road from a nutritional perspective? Like, what does 10 years from now look like? Maybe your company's making it, or maybe these advances are already in play now, but how will we be optimizing ourselves with supplements 10 years from now?
Yeah. Great question, especially since no one saw COVID just blowing out everyone's expectation of what 2020 was going to look like. So I will be very unmeasured here and still try to make a 10-year forecast here. I think that ketones will be thought as a standalone proper fourth macronutrient, right? So ketones, basically in normal nutrition or traditional nutrition, is just simply thought of as a byproduct of one in a carbohydrate restricted state. Well, now you can consume ketones directly, and they have calories, and those calories produce ATP, and they also have very interesting signaling properties that are very different from fat, protein, carbohydrate. So my sense is that there will be just a broader palette of colors of what foods could be, right? If you think about all our foods today, they're just like a remixed combination of fat, protein, carbohydrate in various configurations. What if you could have a fourth color in there? Ketones could be in the mix, changing up our dietary composition. I think that everyone will have experience, if not are constantly on a continuous biomarker reading for not just glucose, but things like C-reactive protein that measures your inflammation, things like ketones, things like LDL cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides. I think some of these things that we have annual blood tests for our lipids or cholesterol, in that annual checkup is like if we're actually on top of ourselves. Because when I was in college, I didn't do blood tests. Like, I was like, I don't want to. That's scary.
Right.
And now it's like, but like after getting kind of into this weird world of caring about human performance, it's kind of like a sneak peek under the hood. What's my metabolism like? We want snapshots of this. And in the future, we will not just have snapshots. You will have a continuous real-time feed of these important metabolic markers. So you would have real-time feedback okay, a piece of salmon, how does that affect my blood sugar? A piece of steak, you know, I think when you talk to carnivores who claim crazy kind of autoimmune responses to like a pepper, you could actually measure that, right? Maybe you could see inflammation happening. You could see some of the measures of leaky gut, right? And then you can actually square the observation. Yes, I'm not just psychosomatic here. Like I actually have some sort of reaction towards this food. And we can all be much more quantitative to it. So I think that would be a second important, I think, reality that we'll see around the corner. And I know a number of entrepreneurs who are trying to democratize and make it easier for people to get CGMs, right? Continuous glucose monitors are typically prescribed for type 1 diabetics because it's very important for them to measure to keep their blood sugar in that specific range. But more and more consumers are getting access to them, right? Like I was playing around with them 4 years ago, and I think more and more people have heard of these things and are curious about trying. And it's like kind of fun to run experiments. Oh, like what does my blood sugar look like when I'm eating a pineapple versus an apple versus a grape? Like what is my body more adapted towards, right? And there's that well popularized cell paper from Israel showing that the same foods people have very different glycemic responses from. And that makes sense. You know, we all have a little bit of different genetics that has different predispositions to certain types of reactions to certain foods. Like that's the spice of life. We all have different variations. Right. So we will have our own real-time data feed for that. So we will know exactly a personalized dashboard of what we can tolerate well and what we don't tolerate as well as our friends.
Powerful.
And then I think, and this will be just interesting from I would say a regulatory policy, political perspective, but I think, you know, genetic engineering, CRISPR, like the direct manipulation of DNA, it's one of those things that is going to be done, right? Someone's going to do it, right? Like the scientist who CRISPR'd those two twins. Yep. Someone already CRISPR'd humans, right? So he's not going to be the one and only. That'll just be an interesting part of history to see how we as a society figure out how we want to do this and distribute that technology. Like my sense is that you don't really stop technology. It's just like there's too much motivation to want to manipulate ourselves. And it's going to start with therapeutic use cases, right? It's going to start with, oh, we're going to correct someone with terminal cancer. Mm-hmm. And, oh, that's pretty safe. I think we're comfortable with that. And that moral outrage is going to slide where it's like, oh, maybe it's not that big of a deal if I want blue eyes or green eyes. Maybe it's not a big deal if I want to be an inch taller. It's not that big of a deal. And then we're entering a completely new universe. So I think 10 years is a bit on the early side for that, but that would be definitely on the bubble of where I think some of these things, especially on the therapeutic side, will be available.
So it's amazing, and I see all of that coming and more. Of course, then you start getting into that whole that whole concept of post-human world and what that looks like. But you know, these advances are incredible, especially when you think of if it can be done at scale and it's accessible to, you know, the average person. Once that happens, you know, then everything becomes game changer. So it's, you know, how did these things scale, and, you know, what is it affordable? And that's, you know, getting it right first. It's just like the ketone ester was $1,000 a gram. Right now we're able to get it, you know, down to a place where it's affordable for, you know, pretty much most people if they want to experiment with it. Some quick fire questions for you.
All right.
How much sleep do you get a night?
I'm religious about my sleep. I try to get 8 hours of sleep. Eight as maybe hopefully, I don't know. Sometimes eight is pretty standard. Yeah. That's
amazing. So, and that, I guess that speaks to, so then you've got to say to yourself, okay, I've got to be incredibly productive during the hours I do spend at work, right? So how do I enhance that productivity, which may be that's where your nootropic supplements come in. Interesting. 8 hours. Okay. How often do you fast?
About, so I guess I usually eat a pretty time restricted window every single day. So I typically do a 16-8. So just like kind of 2 large meals a day. But I'll do a longer fast, about once a week. I've actually been fasting less over this COVID scenario because I've been doing Murph every single day since 28 days ago. So a Murph workout, have you heard of what a Murph is?
No, tell me, what is that?
It's a CrossFit workout named after one of the Navy SEALs lost.
Michael Murphy.
Yeah, in Operation Red Wings. The workout is a 1 mile run, 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats, and then 1 mile run. And I've done 28 of those in a row in 28 days.
Powerful.
So I'm not fasting. I'm not doing longer fasts because I'm just expending quite a bit more energy than I would normally do when I'm like working.
Yeah, because I read somewhere that you were typically fasting 3 days per week at one point.
Yeah, I think when I'm traveling much more sedentary, when my physical volume isn't as high, then you should consider shifting your calorie consumption. Like I just am more productive. I don't need to eat that much. Like it's just almost like a tempo of what I'm trying to tell my body to do.
Right. So when you do eat, what's your ratio of protein to fat or fat to protein?
I would say my diet is very centered around animal protein or animal product, like steaks, fish, seafood. I've done blocks of carnivore diets. I think it's an interesting approach to nutrition. But I'll but I'll consume, like vegetables. And essentially I find myself being so metabolically flexible that even if I have, 20, 30, 40 grams of carbohydrate after like a long workout, I'll very quickly get back into ketosis. To be honest, I haven't been tracking, I don't food journal anymore, like basically when I was like very, very rigorous, I would test my ketones 3 times a day to see exactly where my ketones were. So my left middle finger was like sacrificed to my own science.
Right.
Because that was like the finger that was kind of the one for offering. Where I think I no longer need that kind of fidelity. I think at a certain point, like you just realize you got to make it intuitive, and that's how you make it actually integral into your life. So for me, it's, going for fattier cuts of meat. So I think if you look at a typical ribeye, it's much typical fat content. So I'd probably say that I would be on what would be kind of on a more modified ketogenic diet with perhaps higher protein content than like the 15. I would say it's probably closer to 30%, 25 to 30% protein, maybe 50% fat, and the remainder in carbohydrate.
So yeah, that's interesting because I too have gone on a journey of, at one point I was almost therapeutic ketogenic, literally like 85% fats, right? 15% protein, no carbs. I haven't, I haven't played with carbs in 4 years. And that's when I was experiencing a lot of that superhuman effects. But slowly I've gone on a journey where, and at the time I was eating salads with a lot of oil and nuts. Slowly I've gone on a journey where, myself as well, over the past year and a half, has been primarily carnivore. and getting my fats mostly from those sources, right? So whether it's eggs or red meat, that's where I'm getting my fat these days, as opposed to having load up on a bunch of butter and oils.
Yep.
So that's really interesting. Another question for you, a bit quick fire. So, I guess with the strategies you currently employ, with all that about supplementation and biohacks, as well as some of those advances likely to come that you mentioned, how long do you envision living? I mean, I know Asprey believes, he's going to live to 180. Peter Diamandis has set a goal of 700, but only because he believes that if he can live to like 150 to 200, then he's going to have access to like some of these genetic and nanotech solutions that'll really push the envelope beyond anything we've considered. But what about you, Geoff? I mean, how long do you believe you will live? And do you even have a specific goal age-wise?
No, I think I think people are trying to make little, sound bites with it. Like, come on, okay, show me your math, Mr. Asprey or Mr. Diamandis. Look, like, I want to live as long as I can. Like, don't get me wrong. I'd love to live a long, healthy, happy life as well. I think all of us would want a little bit that optionality more, right? Mm-hmm. We could all kind of end it if we really wanted to, but let's not be morbid. I think the way I measure it is, are you doing stuff that makes you happy on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, that is, I think, the true metric of a life well lived. Like, if you're living towards 1,000 and doing some shit that you hate, I don't know. Like, right. I probably not want to live that life. So, I think, I think an arbitrary age goal is just kind of flippant and kind of a cheesy thing to talk about. I think it's like, obviously, I think both you and I would agree, let's live as healthfully and as productively as we can every single day. Right. If that means I'm going to live towards, I don't know, 50 because I get hit by a bus in 20 years, then that sucks. Or we all, get killed, by the end of the month because COVID mutates and kills everyone. Like, right. It's just like, there's so much uncertainty in the world where I one of the quotes I like a lot is, let's just keep, like, in times of crazy uncertainty, and to focus on things that you can really solve and be proactive on, is keep the world small, right? Like, if we are in a position to help the broader universe, absolutely, like, put the good vibes out there. But in this case, in terms of like, what is my maximum lifespan? I don't know. But what I can't control is what my day-to-day lifestyle and practices are.
Yeah. Control the controllables, right? Because anything can happen. And I'm with you. I'm a big believer in quality of life. Who cares if we can live till 120, if your last 20 years are kind of dementia. Cool. Yeah, then it's, it's about quality of life. So yeah, very strong. So two last questions for you. You've been very kind with your time, by the way. Thank you so much. What are you reading? What do you read? What are you reading besides all the studies, right? Like, what do you read?
I like reading science fiction. So definitely a sci-fi nerd. I think it's just cool to escape into a parallel universe sometimes, just see like what different authors have in terms of what the future kind of unfolds. It just, that kind of like that curiosity, right? Like, what is a parallel future universe kind of look like? And I actually recently ordered a couple books. One is more related towards psychology. It was I can't recall a title right now, but it's kind of just describing how interpersonal transactional conversations can go and some of the patterns that people have observed. Kind of interesting. And then second book was Roger Penrose's book around kind of constructing the mathematics that you want, that kind of ground up in terms of understanding physics and hopefully moving towards like a grand unified theory of physics. So been kind of, one of the things that I was interested in and I thought I was going to study was physics. My dad was a physicist. He was
Really?
studying. He dropped out of his PhD at UCLA in the physics program. So I always had a interest and love for just mathematically describing the universe around us.
Very interesting. What motivates you?
I think that just goes back to that curiosity. I think it's fun, like doing and experiencing interesting things is inherently motivating. And maybe it's just like, I think there's like an argument, why are you novelty seeking? I don't know. It's just like, I'd rather do some interesting stuff that I haven't done before than the same stuff that I have done before. Like, I don't like that. That might just be an axiom. That might just be my neurotransmitters being burnt out of the same pathways. I'm okay with that. Like that seems to be a decent algorithm for me to just experience new things and create new opportunities.
Final question. I'm going to sneak one more in.
Yeah.
So for the budding entrepreneur that's listening, or for the sales professional who's looking to make the kind of sales you were making when you realize, wait a second, if we scale this, that's $1 million a year. This is a business. To just the individual that wants to strive for something greater, what advice would you give?
I would ask them to think about two things. One is actually having a narrative of tactically where they want to be. I think when you ask people, like, what do you even want in life? People will just say like some generic answers, like, I want to be rich.
Right.
Like, okay, how? Doing what? Right? And like, if you don't have a path to just this nebulous value, I just want more dollars and digits in the bank account, that's not, you cannot work towards that. So my recommendation is like, actually think about what are some like actual things that you want. Like, is that you want your boss's job? Like, do you actually want that job? Like, whose job do you actually want? What does that person do? Like, actually articulate this in a way that's actually approachable. So I think it's important to actually get some definitions of what you want. Not that like, oh, I want to be famous and rich. It's like, yeah, everyone does. I want to be super attractive too, right? Like, cool. It's just like, what is something that you can actually tangibly grasp and study and read and learn about? Mm-hmm. Whether that's, oh, I want to be like Jeff Bezos. Okay, maybe you study him. What did he do? What were his insights? What did he do earlier in his career? So you can find some of these patterns. That would be what I recommend. So like, actually have maybe not necessarily a physical manifestation, like a person, but some actual manifestation of what you want to be doing. And it could be your boss's job. It could be that simple, that next step. Mm-hmm. And that leads to the second point, which is, yeah, just break it down into just tactical problems. I think when it's like, oh, I want to be like a billionaire, Elon Musk inventor guy. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, how do you get there from being like a college student or, you know, a sales guy that's working a 9-to-5 right now? It's like, yeah, that's you can't do it. It's like, it's too many steps. So it goes back to keeping the world small. Like, okay, actually know some stuff about some area. I think most people aren't actually deep in anything. They're just very generalist or very surface level. To actually be of value to the world, you actually need to know more than on some subject than the rest of the world. Like, are you going to be the world expert on anything? Probably not, but you can definitely be a world expert enough to 90% of the people. And like, that's kind of like what you actually need to put yourself towards. So again, it's like, why are people successful? Well, they have spent so much time, or they're very talented to be really, really good and knowledgeable on certain areas. Mm-hmm. And they are exploiting that knowledge in a way that is useful for other people. And I think it's like, okay, what are the tactical steps to get that for yourself? And yeah, it's like for podcasts, it's like, all right, you gotta make great content one at a time, right? Like, we all wish we had Joe Rogan experience level audience. But it's like, okay, what can you do to get there? Are we going to cry that we don't have that audience? Or it's like, okay, the tactical thing is that I'm going to do a great podcast every single week or every single, every couple of days, and be consistent. And I think it's that, so to round off that thought, it's actually be consistent and actually get experience and knowledge in a specific area, and then to actually have a vision of where you're going. And it can't be like some vague, I want to be a rich person.
Powerful stuff, Geoff. Powerful stuff. Thank you so much for spending this time with us. A lot to take away, so many powerful things that anyone listening to this show can actually make use of to really optimize their lives and change their direction, or just simply give themselves an incredible boost to really maximize the opportunities that they have, whether it was the advice you just gave or whether it's getting into ketosis, whether it's fasting. I implore everyone to really seek out how you can utilize these biohacks that are available to anyone, not the wild sci-fi stuff, but what we spoke about today, Geoff, is available to anyone that just puts a little bit of thought into it and a little bit of research after this, and then goes find you, maybe listens to your podcast, which is a wealth of knowledge, by the way, and or looks into your products. So I'll end on this note. Where can those that listen to this show, where can they find you? Where can they find your company? Let us know your details.
Yeah. So the shout outs to check us out is hvmn.com. We're on all the social platforms. So at HVMN on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. And then if you want to follow my personal updates, I'm pretty active on both Twitter and Instagram. And that's at Geoffrey Woo with a G, GeoffreyWoo. And then of course the podcast, HVMN, Healthy and Modern Nutrition Podcast. You'll see us out there every week, twice a week.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Again, it was a pleasure speaking with you, Geoff. I wish you guys tremendous success. Again, you're doing cutting edge stuff, and we need more people not being, a trend follower or doing derivative work, or just, being a carbon copy or a cookie cutter of every other supplement company or software company or solution provider that's out there. We need more individuals like yourself and your company that are on the cutting edge, breaking the mold and bringing really unique solutions to life for people. So thank you very much.
No, thank you for the kind words, Lawrence.